You know, um, you know that feeling when you're just like scrolling through social media and you see someone's perfectly curated summer vacation feed?
Oh, totally. It always looks like this highly engineered theme park, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's all gleaming white cubic buildings and, those infinity pools that just seamlessly blend right into the pristine blue water.
Right. Maybe a perfectly draped linen shirt just like blowing effortlessly in the wind.
Yes. It looks so completely effortless. I mean, it's packaged, it's shiny, and it really just sells this very, very specific fantasy of European travel.
But, I mean, that frictionless reality is entirely artificial. It's basically a visual trick.
A trick?
Yeah, it's designed to hide the sheer logistical nightmare that is operating just like barely out of frame.
Right, because you're looking at an image that implies absolute serenity.
Exactly. But what the photo doesn't show you is the 2-hour line of sweating tourists standing shoulder to shoulder just to stand on that exact blue-domed church step.
Oh man, yeah. The exhaustion.
The exhaustion, the localized inflation, or, the fact that the entire economy of that island has been completely hollowed out just to serve a single industry.
Which is exactly why that glossy theme park veneer is, well, it's shattering right now.
It really is.
We are looking at a European travel landscape that is fundamentally buckling under its own weight. Cities and islands are literally reaching a breaking point.
Because the volume of visitors is degrading the very experience people are traveling thousands of miles to have.
Right. We are witnessing what is essentially the absolute definition of a structural tourism crisis.
And the market's response to that crisis is just to implement record-breaking taxes. I mean, we're seeing unimaginable crowds resulting in this complete, almost absurd disconnect between what travelers are paying out of pocket and the actual quality of the experience they get in return.
Yeah, and that structural crisis is the exact reason for our mission on the deep dive today. We are unpacking a travel guide that actively rejects the fantasy.
I love this guide. It is so brutally
Yeah.
honest.
It really is. It's a logistics-first breakdown called Peloponnese, the honest travel guide to mainland Greece. And the source material comes directly from the incredibly detailed travel podcast, Phil and H Travel. Is it worth it?
Yeah, and we are bypassing the tourism board spin completely today. We're going to unpack the hard costs, the mechanical breakdowns of travel, and the incredible surprises hiding in Greece's most overlooked mainland region.
A peninsula that is literally the size of Wales, by the way.
Which is huge. And to understand why this specific region matters to you, as a traveler looking at a very expensive global map right now, we have to look at the stark contrast the original hosts lay out right at the start of their show.
Right. They frame the entire premise around this staggering economic reality. Let me actually pull the core idea from Phil. He's the co-host who handles all the brutal logistical and financial breakdowns.
He does not hold back.
No, he doesn't. And he points out something that completely rewired how I view Mediterranean travel. Here is his exact quote.
Let's hear it.
Santorini's new cruise levy hit €20 per person this summer. And for that €20, you do not get a meal, you do not get a bed, you do not get a single drink. You get permission to step off a boat onto a volcanic island with barely any ruins. For the price of one Greek island levy, the Peloponnese gives you entry to the stadium where the Olympic Games were invented in 776 BC, a 14,000-seat theater with acoustics that baffle modern architects, and the Palace of Agamemnon himself. That price gap is the most undiscussed story in European travel right now.
I mean, wow, it just forces a massive reevaluation of value. And H, his co-host, who focuses more on the actual on-the-ground experience,
Yeah.
the safety, the vibe, the day-to-day reality, she sets up the alternative perfectly right after that.
Yeah, what does she say?
Her exact intro is this. Welcome to Phil and H Travel. Is it worth it? Today, we're leaving the cruise ship queues and caldera selfie crowds behind and heading to the Greek mainland, a peninsula the size of Wales, with 5 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, beaches so clear the water looks wrong, ancient ruins that genuinely change your perspective on what civilization means, and a daily budget that makes Santorini look like a luxury tax experiment. We are going to tell you exactly what it costs, what breaks, what surprises, and whether Greece's most overlooked mainland region is worth your time and your money in 2026.
What's fascinating here is that they explicitly promise real costs and logistics. So we're going to trace their journey chronologically, jumping through all 11 of their modules.
Right, from the moment you start budgeting to the day you actually fly out.
And to really understand the financial mechanics at play here, we have to start with the foundational issue that is driving this entire shift: the sheer economics of overcrowding.
Because the numbers driving the shift are just, well, they're staggering. I mean, Greece recently collected nearly 369 million euros in tourism levies in just the first full year after they fundamentally restructured their tax system.
Wait, 369 million?
Yes. And their financial projections indicate that by the end of 2026, that number will exceed 570 million euros.
Over €500 million just in entry and bed taxes. I mean, where does that money even coming from? Because that feels significantly higher than like the standard couple of euros you leave on the hotel desk when you check out in Italy or France.
Oh, it is much higher. And the mechanism behind it is really critical to understand. It is not just a single flat tax anymore. Greece has implemented this compounding two-layer system.
Okay, 2 layers. Walk me through it.
So the first layer is the climate resilience fee. This is a nightly charge that ranges from €1.50 all the way up to €10 per night.
I imagine that scales based on like the luxury tier of the hotel you book.
Exactly. If you are staying in a 5-star resort in peak season, you are paying that €10 maximum every single night you're there. But that is only the first layer. The real hammer is the second layer, which is the cruise sustainable tourism fee.
Ah, this is the €20 Santorini fee Phil mentioned in the intro.
Yes, exactly. If you are arriving at highly saturated ports, places like Santorini or Mykonos, during the peak summer season, that fee is €20 per person.
Per person. So let's look at the lived reality of that math for a second. Say you're a family of 4, right?
Okay, family of 4.
You've booked a Mediterranean cruise. You wake up, you have your buffet breakfast, and you step onto the tender boat to visit Santorini in August. Before you have taken a single photograph, before you have bought a single souvenir, your family has been taxed €80.
€80, just for the physical footprint of 4 human beings standing on a rock.
Just for the permission to exist in that overcrowded space for, what, 6 hours?
Right. Now, it's worth noting that during the shoulder season, that fee drops to €12, and in the deep off-peak winter, it's €4. But here is the critical comparison point. At almost all other standard Greek ports, the maximum cruise fee is legally capped at €5.
Wow. So the government is using taxation as a blunt instrument to literally price people out of the most famous islands to prevent them from, like, sinking under the weight of foot traffic.
That is exactly what they're doing. But this is where the Peloponnese presents such a massive tactical advantage for a traveler. Because it is a peninsula attached to the mainland rather than a standalone island, it completely circumvents the cruise levy trap.
Right. You cannot legally be charged an island arrival fee to drive onto a peninsula.
Exactly. Furthermore, the accommodation landscape in the Peloponnese is completely different. It lacks the hyper-concentrated, high-density luxury resort infrastructure of Mykonos. Because the hotels are generally smaller, family-run, or historic boutique properties, they often sit in a much lower climate resilience fee bracket.
So you are literally saving money while you sleep.
You really are.
But, the financial savings only matter if the destination's actually worth seeing. I mean, a cheap trip to an empty field is still a waste of money, right? So what makes this region so valuable?
It comes down to the density of significance. The Peloponnese contains more monumental ancient history per square kilometer than any other region in Greece.
Yeah, the guide mentions 5 distinct UNESCO World Heritage Sites located within just a few hours' drive of each other.
Right.
And I want to spend some real time on these sites because just listing them off really doesn't do justice to what they actually are. Let's start with ancient Olympia.
Okay, let's do it.
When people hear Olympia, I think they usually picture a modern stadium. But this is the literal birthplace of the Olympic Games in 776 BC. This isn't just a museum with some dusty pottery in a glass case.
No, not at all.
You can walk right into the original stadium, stand on the exact marble starting blocks where athletes stood nearly 3,000 years ago, and just look down the track.
It's wild. And what makes Olympia so fascinating from an archaeological standpoint is the scale of the destruction and preservation. The site features the ruins of the massive temple of Zeus.
Oh, yeah.
In the 6th century, a series of catastrophic earthquakes struck the region. The massive columns of the temple, which are made of these enormous drum-like segments of stone, they toppled over like dominoes.
And they're still there.
They're still there. They haven't been meticulously re-erected to look like a Hollywood set. They are lying in the dirt exactly where they fell 1,500 years ago. The raw, unfiltered scale of that history is just profoundly moving.
It really is. And then you drive a couple hours and you hit Mycenae. This shifts you out of the classical Greek era of
Yeah.
philosophers and democracy, and throws you deep back into the Bronze Age.
Right, this is the citadel of King Agamemnon, the guy who commanded the Greek forces during the Trojan War.
Yeah, and the architecture at Mycenae is so overwhelmingly massive that it spawned its own mythological term.
Oh, the Cyclopean masonry.
Exactly. When classical Greeks from later eras discovered the ruins of Mycenae, they couldn't fathom how normal human beings could have moved these massive limestone boulders to build the citadel walls. So they just assumed a race of giant one-eyed monsters called Cyclops built it.
Which makes sense when you see it. You walk up to the famous Lion Gate, which is the main entrance to the citadel, and you realize you are looking at a lintel stone that weighs over 20 tons, just suspended right over your head.
It's genuinely intimidating to stand under it. And speaking of architectural marvels, the third UNESCO site is the sanctuary of Epidaurus, which features the ancient theater. We will touch on the specific acoustic trick of this theater later, but the purpose of Epidaurus is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a place to watch plays.
No, it was effectively the most famous healing center of the classical world. It was a sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine.
So people went there for medical treatment.
Yes. People would travel from all over the Mediterranean to seek cures. The theater was built as part of the healing process, based on the belief that experiencing dramatic art and achieving catharsis was medically beneficial to a patient's physical health.
And imagine a modern hospital prescribing you a ticket to a one-class theatrical performance to help lower your blood pressure. I mean, the ancients were really on to something.
They were.
Then we move out of antiquity entirely and hit Mystras. This is a substantially intact Byzantine walled city just clinging to the side of the Taygetos Mountains.
Mystras is a brilliant example of how geography dictates history. It was built defensively on a really steep hill, serving as the center of Byzantine power in southern Greece before eventually falling to the Ottomans.
Right.
Walking through Mystras today is like wandering through a ghost town of palaces, monasteries, and incredibly vibrant frescoed churches that was essentially abandoned. It requires a lot of steep walking, but it offers a complete immersion into the medieval world.
And rounding out the five is Monemvasia. If Mystras is a city on a hill, Monemvasia is a city hiding behind a rock.
Oh, Monemvasia is incredible.
It's an entire medieval port town carved into the side of a massive rock promontory that juts out into the sea. And from the mainland, you can't even see the town. You just see this towering rock. It was designed that way to be completely invisible to passing pirate ships.
And it is entirely pedestrianized today. No cars are allowed inside the lower town walls. It has a permanent population of only about 60 residents, but the stone alleyways, the vaulted archways, and the churches have been remarkably preserved.
So just to recap, we have the birthplace of the Olympics, the citadel of the Trojan War, a mathematically perfect healing theater, a Byzantine mountain capital, and a hidden pirate-proof fortress town.
Right.
And the absolute mic drop moment of the guide is the cost. The combined adult entry to see all five of those world-altering historical sites is under 60 euros.
Which brings us right back to the central thesis. You can spend 80 euros in taxes for a family just to stand on Santorini, where the only significant ancient ruin is the Akrotiri site.
Which charges an additional 12-euro entry fee, by the way.
Exactly. Or you can spend less than 60 euros per person to essentially walk through the entire timeline of human civilization in the Peloponnese.
But unlocking that immense value requires timing your strike perfectly. You can't just show up on a random Tuesday in August and expect a frictionless experience, which is why the guide's deep dive into the calendar matrix is so vital.
The timing of a Mediterranean trip dictates the entirety of the experience. It alters the landscape, the cost, and your physical comfort.
So let's break that down.
Let's start with the extreme off-season, January through March and November through December.
The deep winter. I look at photos of Greece and my brain just assumes it is perpetually 85 degrees and sunny. I always forget that it's a mountainous country with actual seasons.
Oh, it gets genuinely cold by Greek standards, hovering around 8 to 14 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 46 to 57 degrees Fahrenheit.
Definitely need a jacket for that.
For sure. The archaeological sites switch to heavily reduced winter hours, usually closing by mid-afternoon. And obviously, the beach is entirely out of the question unless you are heavily invested in cold water immersion therapy.
Huh. But the guide actively praises this window for a very specific type of traveler, don't they?
They do. They use a wonderful term. They say the winter offers a specific texture.
Texture, I like that.
Yeah, you get the scent of wood smoke hanging in the mountain villages. In November and December, the high trails in Arcadia open up for serious hiking without the risk of heat exhaustion. But the biggest draw is absolute solitude.
Solitude in Europe, that's rare.
Exactly. Imagine having the entire citadel of Mycenae entirely to yourself, with mist rolling over the stones. Combine that with the fact that accommodation hits its absolute floor. I mean, you can rent beautiful stone guest houses for 30 to 50 euros a night.
Okay, but if you want the sun, you have to look at the primary window, right? April and May.
Yeah.
This is the sweet spot.
Spring in the Peloponnese is a biological event. The winter rains have soaked the mountains, and by April, the entire region just erupts in wildflowers. The deep Mycenae Peninsula, which is famously arid and severe in the summer, turns a vibrant, shocking green.
And the temperatures are civilized. You are looking at a perfect 18 to 22 degrees Celsius, so mid-60s to low 70s Fahrenheit.
Which is the exact temperature you want when you are walking across 200 hectares of exposed archaeology at ancient Olympia. You can actually absorb the history without your brain boiling inside your skull.
Always a plus.
Financially, it's brilliant too because the summer surge pricing hasn't kicked in yet. Hotels are generally 40 to 60% cheaper in May than they will be in July.
But then July arrives. June, July, and August, the peak of the Mediterranean summer.
And the heat builds rapidly. By late July and August, daily highs frequently hit 30 to 35 degrees Celsius, which puts you in the 90s Fahrenheit. And because the Peloponnese is a large landmass, it doesn't always benefit from the cooling Meltemi winds that sweep across the Cycladic islands in the summer. The heat really just settles in the valleys.
The guide uses a great analogy for this. They warn that trying to tour an exposed site like ancient Olympia in August after 10:00 a.m. is essentially like climbing inside a stone kiln. The marble literally radiates heat back up at you.
It becomes a genuine logistical hazard, especially for families. Your entire schedule has to be rewired. You must be at the ruins by 8:00 a.m., and by 1:00 p.m. you have to be seeking shade, eating lunch, or submersed in the ocean.
And how are the crowds then?
Well, the beach towns, places like Stoupa on the Mycenae Peninsula or the waterfront in Naklio, they reach their peak capacity. Mid-range boutique hotels will peak at around 120 to 180 euros a night.
But even at peak capacity, the guide notes a crucial distinction. It is never Santorini busy.
Right, because the mechanism of the crowding is totally different. The Peloponnese gets busy with Athenians driving down for their summer holidays and European road trippers. It does not experience the sudden, overwhelming deluge of a cruise ship docking and forcibly injecting 5,000 day trippers into a town built for 500.
That makes a lot of sense. It is a more organic, sustainable level of peak season.
Exactly. Which brings us to the secondary window, the hidden gem of the calendar, September and October.
I love traveling in October.
It's the best. By mid-September, the families with school-aged children just evaporate. The crowds thin out, and the accommodation prices drop 30 to 40% off their August peaks. But the distinct advantage autumn holds over spring is the sea temperature.
Because the Mediterranean has basically been sitting on a stovetop all summer long.
Exactly. The water has been baking for 3 months, so even if the air temperature drops to a comfortable 24 degrees Celsius in October, the seawater is still incredibly warm and perfect for swimming.
Not to mention, the agricultural cycle brings a huge benefit. September into early October is the harvest season for the Nemea wine country, which is one of the premier wine-producing regions in Greece.
So if you are a couple looking to balance world-class archaeology with wine tasting and warm ocean swimming without the brutal heat, September and October are unmatched.
Absolutely.
However, if you are planning a trip for 2026, the guide flags one incredibly specific event that might force you to consider a summer visit.
Ah, yes. The Epidaurus Festival. I had never heard of this before, but the way they describe it, it sounds like an absolute bucket list cultural event.
It is the single highest value cultural experience you can have in Greece. Every summer, during the Athens Epidaurus Festival, they stage live performances of ancient Greek dramas placed by Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes inside the original 2,300-year-old ancient theater of Epidaurus.
Wait, they actually let thousands of people sit in the ancient ruins for a live show.
Yes. The preservation of the limestone seating is so remarkable that it functions perfectly. You're sitting under the stars, in a forest, watching a tragedy being performed in the exact space it was designed for millennia ago.
That sounds chilling.
It is a profound, chilling experience. But the logistics are ruthless. The tickets for the summer 2026 season will go on sale internationally around March. They range from just 15 to 40 euros, which is incredibly cheap for what it is, but they sell out globally.
So you have to be ready.
You must book via the official festival website months in advance. You cannot just roll up to the gate in July and expect to get a seat.
That level of logistical planning brings us perfectly to the next reality check.
Mm-hmm.
We know the value, we know the history, we know the weather. But how do you actually physically get there? Stepping off the plane is where the glossy fantasy instantly collides with hardcore logistics.
Yeah, the infrastructure of the Peloponnese dictates your entry point. For most international travelers flying from outside Europe, Athens International Airport is the mandatory gateway.
Right.
However, if you are flying from within Europe, Kalamata Airport, located right in the southern Peloponnese, has aggressively expanded its connections. Between May and October, you can catch direct low-cost flights to Kalamata from major hubs like London, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt.
Landing directly in Kalamata obviously saves you a massive drive. But let's assume the standard route, right? You land in Athens. You now face a stark binary transport decision. The guide breaks down two paths, and the divergence in experience is massive. Path 1 is utilizing public transit, specifically the KTL bus network.
We really need to define what KTLL actually is because tourists often misunderstand it. KTLL is not a centralized government tourist transport agency.
Oh, it's not?
No, it is a cooperative network of regional buses run by syndicates of local operators. Its primary function is to serve the local Greek population, taking university students back to their villages, moving agricultural workers, connecting provincial towns to the capital.
Which explains the logistics of using it. The guide points out that if you want to take the bus to Nafplio, which is the historic first capital of modern Greece and the standard starting point for a Peloponnese trip, it takes about 2.5 hours and costs a ridiculously cheap 14 euros and 50 cents. But there's a massive catch right out of the gate.
The catch is geography. The bus does not depart from the Athens airport. It departs from the KTL Peloponnese terminal, which is located on Kifisou Street, deep in the urban sprawl of Western Athens.
Oh, wow.
So after you land, you have to navigate an airport express bus or pay for a 15 to 20 euro taxi ride, fight through Athenian traffic, and arrive at a chaotic, loud, purely functional bus depot just to begin your journey.
It is the opposite of a frictionless arrival, which is why the guide is absolutely adamant about Path 2, rent a car.
They do not present this as optional advice. If you want to actually unlock the Peloponnese, a car is mandatory. Renting a compact car straight out of Athens Airport will cost between 35 and 55 euros a day, and the moment you merge onto the E94 motorway heading west out of Athens, the trip fundamentally changes.
The drive itself delivers one of the most unexpected moments of the whole trip. The guide calls it the Corinth Canal shock.
It is a brilliant description. Because the Peloponnese is technically a peninsula, it is connected to the rest of Greece by a narrow strip of land called the Isthmus of Corinth. For thousands of years, ships had to sail hundreds of miles all the way around the dangerous southern capes of the peninsula.
Just to get to the other side.
Yes. In ancient times, the Greeks actually built a paved trackway called the Diolkos to drag ships out of the water and pull them over the land. The Roman Emperor Nero actually started digging a canal with slave labor, but abandoned it.
But then, in the late 19th century, French and Greek engineers finally blew a hole straight through the rock. And the visual reality of driving over it today is staggering.
It really is. You are driving on a totally normal, modern highway. You pay a standard toll of about 4 euros and 50 cents, and suddenly, without much warning, the earth just splits open.
You look out the window, and there is a gorge, cut dead straight through solid limestone, dropping 100 meters down. At the bottom is this incredibly narrow sliver of neon emerald water. And if you time it right, you will see a massive cargo ship or a cruise liner literally threading the needle through this trench, with only feet of clearance on either side of its hull.
And this raises a fascinating question about modern travel culture. Why does an engineering marvel of this magnitude almost never appear on social media feeds?
The guide nays the answer.
Mm-hmm.
It is because the Corinth Canal does not compute with the algorithmic expectation of what Greece is supposed to look like.
Exactly.
The algorithm wants bougainvillea, white succo, and a chilled glass of Assyrtiko wine. It doesn't know how to categorize a brutal 19th century feat of raw industrial rock blasting. It isn't cute, it is monumental.
But the guide urges you to pull over. There is a specific pedestrian bridge viewing point. They tell you to park the car, get out, and just stand over the precipice for 2 minutes. It acts as an incredible psychological palate cleanser. It forcibly resets your expectations. You realize you are no longer in a manicured, sanitized resort environment. You are entering a landscape of immense physical scale.
And that grounded reality continues the moment you arrive at your first logical overnight base, the coastal city of Nafplio.
Nafplio is the perfect transition zone. It is wildly picturesque, but it is deeply authentic. The arrival is visually disorienting in the best way.
How so?
Well, you are driving into a functioning, working harbor town. There are fishing boats, ferries, and commerce happening. But looming directly above the town, clinging to an impossibly steep cliff face, is the Peloponnese. It's a massive, sprawling stone fortress built by the Venetians in the early 1700s. And if that isn't enough, you look out into the bay, and sitting in the water is a separate, standalone island castle called the Borzi.
It feels like a movie set, but the sensory details prove it is a living city. The guide paints this incredible picture. You aren't walking past endless rows of identical luxury boutiques. You are walking down narrow streets lined with 19th century neoclassical mansions and actual fruiting orange trees.
The contrast with the island experience is sharp. There are no €280 cave suites carved into a cliff here. Instead, you sit down at a taverna on a side street, and the atmosphere isn't curated lounge music. It's the sound of local families having lunch. You are smelling the sharp tang of feta cheese aging in brine, the exhaust from a passing delivery scooter, the sweet scent of orange blossoms, and maybe the distant metallic clinking of goat bells from the surrounding hills.
And in the autumn, they mention the smell of the Nemea grape harvest drifting through the valleys. It's a town that hasn't been completely hollowed out and turned into a hollow shell just for visitors. It has its own heartbeat.
So we've established that the environment is authentic and the history is world-class. But the fundamental question remains, how much does it actually cost to exist in this space?
Right. We need to talk about the cost floor. Let's break down the economics of beds, food, and the unwritten rules of surviving the local taverna culture.
The accommodation matrix in the Peloponnese is fascinating because it proves that high-quality travel does not have to trigger massive debt. The inflation curve here is much flatter than in the Cyclades. Let's start at the absolute floor, the backpacker tier.
We were talking 22 to 45 euros a night, right?
Exactly. There are established, clean facilities like Hostel Nafplio that operate year-round, offering dorm beds starting at just 22 euros. But even beyond hostels, if you travel in the shoulder season of May or October, you can easily find family-run guest house rooms in spectacular coastal villages like Kardamyli or Stoupa for 35 to 45 euros a night.
That's incredibly reasonable.
It is. And these aren't dingy basements. These are often simple, incredibly clean rooms with balconies looking out over the Mycenaean Gulf.
Now let's scale up to the mid-range couple. The guide positions this as the ultimate sweet spot for the region, where the value proposition is frankly unbeatable.
For a mid-range traveler, you are looking at spending between 80 and 150 euros a night. In Nafplio, Phil, the logistics co-host, specifically recommends the Hotel Nefsimidon. It is a restored 1830s neoclassical townhouse. It has sea-facing rooms, breakfast in a courtyard filled with palm trees, and in the peak summer season, it maxes out at around 110 to 140 euros a night.
Though Phil, being his usual blunt self, does offer a very practical warning about that place. Because it is a heavily protected, authentic heritage building, there is no elevator, which is wonderfully charming right up until the moment you have to drag a 60-pound suitcase of 3 flights of narrow, sweeping wooden stairs in the middle of a hot afternoon.
A vital piece of logistical intelligence. For families, the dynamic shifts. Renting 2 separate hotel rooms destroys a budget, so the guide strongly advocates for self-catering villas. Down on the Mani Peninsula, in towns like Stoupa, you can rent a fully equipped 2-bedroom apartment with a kitchen that sleeps 4 people for between 90 and 130 euros a night.
But I want to look at the top end, the luxury tier, because this is where the economic comparison with the famous islands gets really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. The flagship luxury property in the Peloponnese is a resort called Amanzo, located on the eastern coast near Voidokilia. It is a stunning, sprawling complex modeled after a modern acropolis. In the absolute peak of high season, their entry-level pavilion suites, which feature private plunge pools, start around 600 euros a night. But in the shoulder season, those rates can drop down to between 250 and 300 euros.
With the absolute pinnacle of luxury in the region, bottoms out at 250 euros off-peak.
Yes, and that exposes a massive truth about the region. The absolute ceiling for luxury pricing in the Peloponnese sits significantly lower than the standard luxury entry point in Santorini or Mykonos. You're simply not paying the manufactured caldera premium.
Right, there's no artificial scarcity driving the price of a basic hotel room to €1,000 a night just because it has a view of a volcano.
The guide makes a brilliant philosophical point about this. They argue that this lower luxury ceiling is either the region's greatest appeal or its fatal flaw, depending entirely on how you define luxury. If your definition of a luxury vacation requires a €2,000 a night price tag, a globally recognized designer beach club, and bottle service to validate the experience, well, the Peloponnese will disappoint you.
But if your definition of luxury is having an uninterrupted hour alone in a Byzantine palace, followed by a locally sourced meal overlooking an empty cove, it overdelivers spectacularly.
Speaking of locally sourced meals, we have to talk about the food system. Because saving money on a hotel doesn't help if you get gouged the second you sit down to eat.
The food economics of the Peloponnese are fundamentally distant from the islands because of the supply chain. I mean, think about it. Santorini is a barren volcanic rock. Every single tomato, every block of cheese, every bottle of water has to be loaded onto a ferry in Athens, shipped across the sea, unloaded at a port, and trucked up a cliff. The logistical premium baked into the price of a salad is astronomical.
Whereas the Peloponnese is the agricultural engine of southern Greece.
Exactly. When you eat in Kalamata, the olive oil on your table likely came from the trees you drove past 10 minutes ago. The citrus comes from the plains of Argos. The feta is produced by local shepherds in the mountains. You are paying the farm gate price, not the imported island price.
But even with lower baseline costs, tourist tracks still exist. So how do you identify them? The guide provides one of the sharpest, most brilliantly simple diagnostic tools I have ever heard for navigating Greek restaurants.
It is foolproof. They state that the division between the local food economy and the tourist trap economy in the Peloponnese is incredibly narrow. You can have a world-class, authentic taverna operating right next door to a place serving microwaved garbage.
So what's the rule?
The diagnostic rule is this. Look at the menu. If the menu is a massive laminated binder featuring high-gloss, multilingual photographs of the food, you are absolutely paying a tourist premium for inferior quality.
The photos are the warning sign.
Yes, because locals don't need a photograph to know what a Greek salad looks like. Conversely, if the menu is a single sheet of paper or simply handwritten in chalk on a board outside the door, you have found the local supply line. You are eating exactly what the residents eat at the price they pay.
To prove this, the hosts actually went into a Sklevinaitis, which is the massive, dominant supermarket chain in Greece, and recorded the hard 2026 grocery prices to establish a benchmark.
And the numbers speak for themselves. A half-kilo block of premium, locally produced feta cheese is €2.80.
Wow.
A full liter of Kalamata extra virgin olive oil, €6.50. A half-liter can of domestic Mythos beer is 95 cents. A family could easily provision a massive high-quality picnic lunch for under €15.
And if you apply the no-photo menu rule at a taverna, the cooked food benchmarks are just as grounded. A massive traditional Voidokilia salad loaded with tomatoes, cucumbers, olives, and a slab of feta runs between €6 and €8. A souvlaki pita, which is the ultimate, universally beloved Greek street food of grilled meat wrapped in flatbread with tzatziki and fries, is roughly €3.50.
$3.50. That's incredible.
You can get a half-liter carafe of the local house wine drawn straight from a barrel for €5 to €7.
But the guide issues a massive flashing red light warning here. There is one specific location in the Peloponnese where these rules completely collapse and thousands of travelers get fleeced every single day. Phil calls it the ancient Olympia captive trap.
This section of the guide stressed me out just reading it. He is militantly clear on this. Under no circumstances should you ever eat at a restaurant located within a 100-meter radius of the main entrance to the ancient Olympia archaeological site.
The psychology behind the trap is highly predatory.
Yeah.
Think about the physical state of the customer. They have just spent 3 hours walking across massive ruins in the blazing sun. They are physically exhausted, deeply dehydrated, and their blood sugar has completely crashed.
Oh, they're exhausted.
When they exit the gates, they have zero capacity for critical decision-making. They simply collapse into the very first available chair they see.
They are the ultimate captive audience.
And the restaurants bordering the exit know this. As a result, they charge a 40 to 50% markup on food that is objectively, measurably worse than anything else in the region. They don't need to cook well because they know they will never see that customer again. And there's a fresh busload of exhausted tourists arriving in 10 minutes.
So what is the logistical fix?
Pure willpower. You exit the site, you ignore the touts holding the laminated photo menus, and you just keep walking. Walk 5 minutes down the main approach road, take a left turn into the back streets of the modern village of Olympia, and find a place where the locals who work at the site are eating. It is the difference between paying 18 euros for a sad microwave moussaka and paying 9 euros for a brilliant, freshly roasted piece of lamb.
Beyond avoiding traps, the guide also lays out the unwritten rules of social etiquette, which revolve heavily around timing. If you show up at a taverna at 6:30 or 7:00 p.m. expecting a bustling dinner service, you are effectively waving a massive neon flag that says tourists.
Right. The Greek culinary clock is shifted dramatically later than in the US or Northern Europe. Lunch is a major event, rarely starting before 2:00 cm. Because of the afternoon heat, the late lunch leads into a rest period. Dinner doesn't really get going until 9:00 p.m., and it is entirely normal to see families with young children sitting down to eat at 10:00 p.m.
Tipping is another point of anxiety for travelers, but it's straightforward here. It isn't a strict, mandatory 20% calculation on every bill like in the States. The cultural standard is generally to round up the bill. If a coffee is 3.50, you leave 4 euros. If a taverna meal is 44 euros, leaving a 50 euro note and saying keep the change is considered generous and polite.
But perhaps the most rigid etiquette rule in the entire guide has nothing to do with food. It involves visiting the region's incredible Orthodox monasteries.
Oh, the dress code.
Exactly. The guide specifically highlights the monastery of Osios Loukas. It is a stunning UNESCO-listed Byzantine complex and absolutely worth the detour. But the monastic dress code is fiercely enforced. Women must have their shoulders completely covered, and they must wear skirts or dresses that fall well below the knee. Trousers on women are often rejected. Men must wear long trousers. Shorts are not permitted.
And there is no debate about this, right?
Zero debate. There are often no large warning signs, and the monks or attendants will not argue with you. If you show up in a tank top and shorts, you are simply physically blocked at the gate. The guide recommends that female travelers always carry a lightweight scarf or a wrap in their day pack, specifically to throw over their shoulders when exploring rural areas.
Okay, so we have tallied up the hotels, the transport, the cheap brine, and the entry fees. What does this all mean for the fundamental daily budget? The guide creates this incredibly clear budget matrix.
Yes, they distill all the logistics down into 3 out-of-pocket daily budgets per person. Let's start with the low-end backpacker. Assuming you stay in a hostel, buy supermarket groceries for breakfast and lunch, eat 1 casual taverna meal, and rely solely on the KTLL bus, you're looking at a total daily spend of between 57 and 74 euros.
Incredible. And for the mid-range couple?
This assumes splitting a 100 euro a night boutique hotel room, the daily cost of a compact rental car and fuel, entry fees to ruins, and 2 solid sit-down meals a day. That comes to between 95 and 160 euros per person per day.
I really want to emphasize that absolute top-end number, 160 euros a day. The guide directly compares this to Santorini, pointing out that to achieve that exact same mid-range lifestyle, a nice room, a car, good food, you are spending between 180 and 280 euros per person per day on the island. The mainland is nearly half the cost.
It's wild, and at the high end, the luxury tier, staying at boutique historical properties and eating upscale multi-course meals, you cap out at around 245 to 430 euros per person per day.
But the guide doesn't stop at just measuring tourist vacations. They take a fascinating detour into the economics of actually living there. They look at the rising trend of digital nomads.
The infrastructure of the Peloponnese makes it uniquely suited for remote work, doesn't it?
It really does. Cities like Kalamata and Nafplio have robust year-round economies. They don't shut down and board up their windows in November like the resort islands do. They have fiber-optic internet, co-working spaces, and functioning winter societies.
The monthly math they present for a digital nomad is incredibly compelling. If you rent a 1-bedroom apartment, mix up your grocery shopping with local taverna meals, pay for a co-working desk, and rent a scooter for local transit, your total monthly cost of living sits comfortably between 1,150 and 1,700 euros.
Try finding a coastal city in California or the south of France where you can live well for 1,500 euros a month. And Greece is aggressively targeting this demographic. The guide outlines the specifics of the Greek digital nomad visa. It was introduced a few years ago and is fully entrenched as a legal pathway in 2026.
What are the actual requirements to get it?
The primary hurdle is financial proof. You need to officially prove a net remote income of 3,500 euros a month. If you clear that bar, the Greek government will grant you a 12-month residence permit, which can be renewed. It is a highly structured legal invitation to bypass the tourist bubble entirely and integrate into a working Greek city.
But whether you are staying for a week or a year, the geography of the Peloponnese demands respect. If you don't understand the terrain, the region will break you. This leads us directly into what Phil considers the most important part of the guide: the 3 brutal logistics traps.
These are the traps that consistently ruin vacations. They're born from assumptions that travelers make based on how other European countries operate. Trap number 1 is the public transport is fine assumption.
We touched on this earlier with the KTL buses. I have traveled in Switzerland and Germany, where the train network is a flawlessly integrated machine designed specifically to move tourists seamlessly between major attractions. People assume Greece will be the same.
And that assumption is fatal to a tightly packed itinerary. The mechanism of the trap is failing to understand the purpose of the KTL bus network. It is not designed to optimize a tourist's site-hopping schedule. It is designed in a hub-and-spoke model to connect rural villages to provincial capitals so locals can go to the bank or visit a doctor.
The guide uses a terrifyingly real example of how this breaks down in practice. Say you wake up in Naplio and you want to visit ancient Olympia. On a map, they look relatively close. But there is no direct tourist bus.
Oh no.
To do it on public transit, you have to take a bus from Naplio to the central transit hub of Tripoli. Then you wait. Then you catch a second bus winding through the mountains to Pyrgos. Then you wait again. Finally, you take a local bus to the village of Olympia.
A journey that takes 2.5 hours in a rental car suddenly consumes 5 agonizing hours of waiting at concrete bus stations. If you try to go from Olympia down to the Byzantine ruins of Mystras, it requires a convoluted connection in the city of Sparta that takes at least 3 hours. Direct lateral tangents between the major archaeological sites literally do not exist.
The lived reality is that if you rely entirely on the bus, you lose half your vacation to transit logistics. You miss half-day sites like Nemea entirely because the bus schedule doesn't align. And eventually, you get so frustrated that you start bleeding money on 20-euro emergency taxi rides just to bridge the gaps between the bus stops and the actual ruins.
You end up spending 200 euros on fragmented taxi rides over a week. The fix, again, is blunt and uncompromising. Rent the car. The geography of the Peloponnese is incredibly dense. The drive from Naplio to Mystras is a stunning, smooth hour-and-a-half journey on modern roads. Having a compact car makes visiting 4 world-class UNESCO sites in 5 days comfortably achievable. Without it, you are hostage to the commuter schedule.
Trap number 2 is perhaps the most painful to read about, simply because it is entirely avoidable. We hinted at the heat earlier, but Phil codifies it as the ancient Olympia timing error.
He paints a vivid, terrifying scene of what this trap looks like when it springs. It is 10:00 a.m. on a Tuesday in July. The massive air-conditioned tour buses that departed Athens at dawn finally arrive and flood the parking lot. Simultaneously, the cruise ship tenders docking at the nearby port of Katakolon dump thousands of day trippers onto chartered coaches.
Oh boy, the convergence.
Exactly. They all converge on ancient Olympia at the exact same moment. And remember, the site is 265 hectares of wide-open, excavated archaeology. The trees were cleared centuries ago. There is zero shade over the ancient stadium. The temperature is already 32 degrees Celsius and climbing.
So you have traveled thousands of miles to stand at the marble starting blocks of the original Olympic Stadium, a place of immense historical weight and silence, and instead you are crammed shoulder to shoulder with 300 sweating, irritable tourists staring at the back of someone's sun hat, listening to 20 different tour guides shouting over each other in different languages.
It transforms what should be a profoundly moving, almost spiritual historical experience into a physically draining endurance test. You aren't absorbing history. You're just trying to survive the heat and the crowds.
The fix requires discipline. You must arrive at the entrance gates exactly at 8 a.m. when they unlock. Do not wait in the ticket line. Buy your 12-euro entry ticket online in advance through the official Greek e-ticketing portal. Have the QR code on your phone.
If you execute that strategy, the guide promises magic.
It does. From 8 a.m. to about 9:30 a.m., the site is effectively empty. The tour buses haven't arrived, the heat hasn't settled in the valley. You get 90 uninterrupted minutes to walk through the birthplace of the Olympics in the cool morning light, listening to nothing but the wind in the pine trees and the sound of cicadas.
That sounds incredible.
It is a flawless experience, but people fall into the trap because nobody warns them how incredibly brief that window of perfection actually is. By 9:45 a.m., the illusion is shattered.
Which brings us to trap number 3. This one isn't about crowds or heat. It is about basic, fundamental survival in an unforgiving landscape. The deep manifuel and ATM gap.
The Mani is the central peninsula of the three fingers that drop down from the southern Peloponnese. It stretches all the way down to Cape Matapan, which is the southernmost tip of mainland Europe. Geographically, it is severe, arid, and dramatic.
The guide describes driving south of the main town of Areopoli into the deep Mani. It's a land of deserted coves, sheer cliffs, and these incredible, austere stone tower villages where local clans used to wage blood feuds against each other. It is visually stunning, but it is severely under-resourced.
And here is the exact scenario of the trap. You are doing a leisurely road trip. You roll into the deep Mani on a Sunday afternoon. You glance at your dashboard and realize your gas tank is hovering near empty. You check your wallet, and you have no physical cash left. You figured, no problem, I'm in Europe, I'll just use Apple Pay or find an ATM.
And that is when the panic sets in, because you suddenly discover that ATMs down there are extremely scarce. The salt air and lack of maintenance mean the few machines that do exist are frequently broken or completely out of cash by the end of the weekend. To compound the crisis, the local tavernas and the tiny stone guest houses you plan to stay in often lack reliable internet for card machines, or they simply refuse to accept anything other than cash.
And the most dangerous part? Many of the solitary independent petrol stations in the Lower Peninsula close their pumps entirely on Sundays.
You are facing a genuine logistical nightmare. You are on a winding coastal road with absolutely no cell phone signal, your tank is dry, you can't pay for a room, and the nearest functioning ATM might be a 30-kilometer drive back up a mountain pass that you don't have the fuel to reach.
The fix here is entirely preventative. The guide draws a hard line at the town of Areopoli. Before you turn south to enter the deep Mani, you stop. You go to a bank machine and withdraw a minimum of 150 euros in cash. You pull into a gas station and you fill your fuel tank to the absolute brim, regardless of how much is currently in it. And you double-check your emails to ensure your accommodation is either prepaid or has explicitly confirmed they take credit cards.
The guide summarizes it beautifully. The deep Mani rewards the prepared visitor with a stark beauty that most travelers to Greece never experience, but it ruthlessly, unapologetically punishes the unprepared.
That concept of risk and punishment transitions us perfectly into understanding safety, solo travel, and what H calls the honest disappointments of the region. Because understanding the real risks fundamentally changes how you carry yourself.
When we talk about safety in the Peloponnese, H makes a very clear, data-driven distinction. The things travelers usually worry about, violent crime, systematic pickpocketing rings, predatory scams are virtually non-existent here. You don't have the sophisticated taxi overcharging networks you sometimes encounter in Athens, and you certainly don't have the aggressive fake menu tourist trap hostility you see in some major European capitals.
The actual danger is much more pragmatic, and it involves the rental car you just picked up. The true risk is rural road safety. Specifically, navigating the massive mountain passes that cut across the Taygetos and Arcadia ranges.
The geography forces the roads to be narrow, sharply winding, and often lacking guardrails. You are sharing these passes with heavy agricultural vehicles, olive trucks, and local drivers who know every single curve of the road by heart.
And Greek rural driving culture is, well, how do we say this politely? Highly assertive.
Yes, assertive is the diplomatic term. They drive fast, they pass on solid lines, and they expect you to pull over to the shoulder to let them by. The guide issues a hard, non-negotiable rule regarding this. Do not drive the spectacular Taygetos mountain pass between the city of Sparta and the coastal town of Kardamyli after dark if you have never driven it before.
That pass is famous. It cuts right through a gorge.
It is arguably one of the most stunning drives in the Mediterranean, but at night, with no streetlights, sheer drops, and oncoming traffic taking corners wide, it is genuinely dangerous for an unacclimated tourist. It is a strict daylight-only route.
In terms of the human element, particularly for solo female travelers and families, H's assessment is overwhelmingly positive. The cultural warmth of the Peloponnese is genuine. Nafplio and Kalamata are incredibly comfortable, walkable cities for a solo traveler to establish a base.
However, she adds a very nuanced note about psychological comfort. Those stunning stone tower villages in the Mani, places like Voidokilia, they look incredible in photographs, but they are very sparsely populated. In the off-season, you might be one of only a handful of people in the entire village.
The isolation could feel overwhelming.
Exactly. It isn't that they are physically unsafe, but the profound silence and isolation of a ruined medieval village might not be the most comforting environment for your very first night traveling solo in a foreign country. She smartly suggests that solo travelers build their confidence by basing themselves in a slightly larger, active town like Kardamyli first, before venturing into the deep, isolated south.
For families, the region is a dream scenario. There is almost no aggressive, late-night clubbing infrastructure to deal with. The main hurdle for parents is simply managing the peak summer heat and ensuring the kids are hydrated. But the payoff for families are the beaches. And the guide highlights one in particular, Voidokilia Beach.
Voidokilia is famous for a reason. It is a geographically perfect, symmetrical crescent bay. There are no sun loungers blocking the sand, no pounding beach club music, no entry fees. The sand is incredibly fine, and the water is shallow and protected from the open ocean, meaning there are no dangerous drop-offs or rip currents. It is the perfect, safe environment for children to swim.
Though Phil, true to his role as the logistics guy, adds a crucial, honest note for parents. Reaching the actual water of Voidokilia requires parking the car and making a gentle but persistent climb over a large sand dune.
Right, it isn't an expedition to Everest, but if you are a parent trying to drag a massive wheeled cooler, a heavy stroller, an umbrella, and two toddlers through deep shifting sand in the midday sun, that dune is going to feel like a mountain. You need to know it's there before you pack the car.
That kind of granular honesty is what makes this guide so valuable. And true to its title, The Honest Travel Guide, they refuse to sugarcoat the region. We have to talk about the disappointments. They explicitly list the places that will let you down.
Let's start with the modern village of ancient Olympia. Travelers often assume that a village sitting next to one of the most famous archaeological sites on Earth will be charming, full of boutique cafes and romantic vistas.
The guide brutally disabuses you of that notion. They explicitly call the modern town of Olympia a functional, utilitarian service town. It exists entirely to process the throughput of mass tourism. It is essentially one long street lined with identical, overpriced souvenir shops selling plastic gladiator helmets, mediocre tavernas designed to churn through bus tours, and mid-budget hotels.
The logistical advice is clear. Do not plan a romantic 3-day stay in the village of Olympia. You stay for one night maximum, purely for the tactical advantage of hitting the ruins at 8 a.m. The ruins are life-changing. The town is entirely skippable.
Then there is Sparta. This is fascinating from a purely historical expectation standpoint. When people hear Sparta, they have been conditioned by movies and pop culture to expect a visual spectacle. They expect it to look like Rome or Athens, full of massive, intimidating, muscular architecture.
Yeah. But the guide points out a brilliant historical irony. The ancient Spartan state, under the laws of Lycurgus, explicitly rejected monumental architecture. Their entire philosophy was that a city's defense should be its men, not its walls. They believed building ornate, massive temples was a sign of decadent weakness.
So they intentionally build nothing permanent.
Exactly. As a direct result of their own ancient philosophy, modern Sparta has almost no physical ruins to show you. There is a modest statue of King Leonidas, a small museum, and the vague outline of an ancient theater in an olive grove. Otherwise, it is just a pleasant, grid-planned provincial town. If you drive to Sparta expecting the visual drama of the movie 300, you will leave deeply frustrated.
The guide's solution: stop in Sparta for an hour, visit the olive oil museum, and then immediately drive 6 kilometers down the road to the Byzantine ruins of Mystras. Mystras will give you the towering, mountainous visual spectacle you are craving.
And the final honest disappointment they list is the drive through the outskirts of Corinth. We talked about the majesty of the Corinth Canal, but the approach to it from the highway is not majestic. It is 20 kilometers of sprawling, ugly light industry, abandoned concrete factories, and chaotic retail parks. The guide warns you not to panic and think, oh no, what have I done? Is this what the whole region looks like? Just push your foot on the gas, push through the industrial sprawl, cross the canal, and the world immediately changes.
So if we pull all of these data points together, the costs, the logistics, the heat, the history, we have to ask the ultimate question. Is this specific trip the right fit for you? Or should you be looking elsewhere? The guide offers 2 main alternatives if the Peloponnese profile doesn't quite match what you want. The first alternative is the island of Crete.
You would pivot to Crete if you want a larger, more highly developed resort ecosystem. Crete is massive, and it has the infrastructure to support massive tourism. It is also the choice if your specific historical interest leans toward the Minoan civilization, like the famous Palace of Knossos, rather than the classical and Bronze Age history of the Peloponnese. Crete also possesses a significant logistical advantage. It has massive international airports in Heraklion and Chania that accept direct flights from all over Europe, bypassing Athens entirely.
But Phil runs the numbers on the cost comparison. Because Crete has higher international demand and brand recognition, mid-range accommodation runs about 100 to 160 euros a night. That is noticeably higher than the 80 to 130 euro average in the Peloponnese. You pay a premium for the convenience of the island infrastructure.
The second alternative is entirely outside of Greece. They suggest looking at Puglia, the southern heel of Italy. You choose Puglia if your absolute priority is food, wine, and aesthetics over dense, monumental archaeology.
Right, if your dream is renting a Fiat, driving past endless olive groves, staying in a whitewashed conical trolley house, and drinking Primitivo wine every night, Puglia is your target.
The financial analysis is fascinating here. The guide calculates that the daily out-of-pocket costs for a road trip through Puglia versus a road trip through the Peloponnese are virtually identical in 2026. The fork in the road is entirely about preference. The Peloponnese wins decisively on the sheer weight of ancient history and mythology. Puglia wins on polished village streetscape aesthetics and culinary reputation.
Which brings us to the grand finale of the deep dive, the absolute core of the original podcast, the Is It Worth It verdict matrix. Phil and H break down their final definitive recommendation based on the specific profile of the traveler.
Let's run through the matrix. For the backpacker, the verdict is a yay, but with conditions. The sheer financial value is incredible. You are accessing world-class history for under 70 euros a day. But the condition is psychological. You absolutely must accept the grueling limitations of the KTL bus network, and you must budget for the occasional, inevitable 20 euro emergency taxi ride when the schedule inevitably breaks down. If you have the patience, it's a yes.
For the mid-range couple, which is their target demographic, the verdict is the strongest, most resounding YS in the entire matrix. The value proposition here is unmatched in modern Europe. For exactly half the cost of a trip to the Cyclades Islands, you are getting a rental car, 5 UNESCO sites, stunning empty coastlines, and incredible Nemea wine. The guide argues that the Peloponnese right now is the exact trip you used to be able to take in Santorini 20 years ago, before the algorithm and the cruise ships destroyed the ecosystem.
For the family traveler, it is a yes, with strict conditions. The safety profile is perfect and the beaches are ideal, but the conditions are non-negotiable. You must rent a car to control your own schedule, and you must have the discipline to manage the July heat by forcing your family to start their days at 8 a.m. If you can do that, it is a brilliant family vacation.
For the luxury traveler, it is a way, yes, but again, with conditions. And the condition is a total mental shift. You must swap the expectation of a perfectly curated, DJ-driven infinity pool overlooking a volcano for the quiet elegance of a historic boutique 19th century mansion and world-class, locally sourced cuisine. If you require aggressive status validation from your luxury, don't go. If you want quiet, historic comfort, it over-delivers at half the price of Mykonos.
And finally, for the digital nomad or the long-term solo traveler, it is a massive yes. Cities like Kalamata and Nafplio feel like real, working, breathing Greek cities with a genuine cost floor that allows you to live well without burning through your savings.
It is a breathtakingly comprehensive, incredibly grounded assessment. It takes a region that is clearly teetering on the verge of being discovered by the wider global market and strips away all the marketing gloss to show you the mechanical reality of how to actually travel there.
And as we wrap up our analysis of their work, we have thoroughly covered all the facts, the complex tax structures, the prices, and the specific traps laid out in their guide.
Which means, as explicitly instructed by the text of the source material itself, I had to sign off this breakdown exactly as the original show demands. That is the honest verdict from Phil and H.
But before you close out of this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Reflect on the fact that for the last 2 decades, the global definition of European travel has been almost entirely dictated by the easiest, the most heavily marketed, and the most visually homogeneous islands. We have been trained to chase a very specific blue and white aesthetic. But as municipal tourism taxes skyrocket into the hundreds of euros just to step off a boat, and as the crowds swell to physically unmanageable, suffocating levels, what does it mean for the entire future of global travel if the absolute best financial value and the most profound, earth-shattering historical connection actually lies on the overlooked, dusty mainlands? Next time you sit down with your credit card to plan a trip, ask yourself a very hard question. Are you paying for a transformative life experience, or are you just paying a luxury tax, stand in line for a photograph someone else has already taken?
It really makes you look at that perfectly curated social media theme park feed a little differently, doesn't it? Take some time this week. Do your own deep dive into the topographical maps of the Peloponnese. Look up the history of the Cyclopean masonry at Mycenae. Research the tasting notes of a Nemea Agugitico wine. And see if the occasionally muddy, intensely real waters of mainland logistics might just hold the clearest, most rewarding experiences in all of Greece. Catch you next time.